Welcome to Szabo Cast. Here we discuss all things from a working class, trans, anarchist, analytical perspective. Due to the nature of this show, listener discretion is advised. My name is Skylar, my pronouns are she, they, they, and I'm your host. Thank you for joining us today.
A new buzzword, or rather buzz phrase, has wiggled its way into the cultural zeitgeist of the previous decade. This phrase being gender ideology. What is gender ideology? Because as a trans person, this puzzles me. It's not a phrase I had to read up on to understand who and what trans people are. I didn't have to have a thorough understanding on gender ideology in order for me to come out as trans. And gender ideology was never a part of the informed consent for gender-affirming care. And I hate to blow my load early, folks, but in terms of gender-affirming care, so-called gender ideology is completely irrelevant. And it's also not even a real thing. Let's get this clear from the very start. Gender ideology, as we understand it, is a scapegoat. It is completely made up for people to attack the trans community. So today, we're going to discuss the rise of the term gender ideology, what it means, and examples of gender ideology in our modern culture. So why don't we break this down? What is an ideology? An ideology is a set of beliefs, values, and principles, and these qualities can be applied to anything, being economic principles, political values, social beliefs, so on and so forth. Somebody who holds an ideology believes that these things are the way they should be. I'll give you a few examples of an ideology. Anarchism is an ideology because it is the belief that no one who has unjustified authority should maintain power. Anarchists look at every single aspect of hierarchy, dominance, and authority and question as to whether or not these specific roles that they play in their place of dominance are legitimate in their place of dominance. That right there is an ideology. And while this ideology can work in conjunction with other ideologies, it is its own ideology, because it is its own set of principles, values, and beliefs. Why don't we look at another ideology, that being Christianity? Christianity is a spiritual religion that takes on the form of the belief of Jesus and his teachings. Keep in mind, however, that various Christians hold different beliefs in the way Jesus taught things, but it's important to remember that Christians are loyal specifically to the word of Jesus and their interpretation of Jesus' preachings. Christianity is an ideology because it holds the values, principles, and beliefs that Jesus preached. In other words, if Jesus didn't say it, it doesn't fucking matter. Now, of course, this is a very flawed way of analyzing social problems that happen today in the contemporary, but it's also important to remember that these people use these teachings to get by and analyze their own life and the world around them through these means. Thus, it is an ideology that guides them through life. And I could go on here. We could talk about various religions, political beliefs, traditions, cultures, so on, so forth. So then, what is gender ideology? Gender ideology sounds mysterious. It also sounds kind of malicious and sinister in its rhetoric. If we are to apply our understanding of ideology to so-called gender ideology, we can understand that so-called gender ideology is the belief that certain genders are supposed to be represented in certain ways. But let's put a pin on that for a moment, and we'll come back to this because I want to talk about what gender ideology is used for in the real world and not just in the theoretical or the hypothetical. How is this phrase being used today?
It is all or nothing. If transgenderism is true, if men really can become women, then it's true for everybody of all ages. If transgenderism is false, as it is, if men really can't become women, as they cannot, then it's false for everybody too. And if it's false, then we should not indulge it, especially since that indulgence requires taking away the rights and customs of so many people. If it is false, then for the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen prey to this confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology.
There is that word, ideology. But first of all, what is transgenderism? That's a weird one, because I didn't know that there needed to be an ideology in order for trans people to exist. I didn't know that there needed to be a manifesto or a constitution that trans people needed to adhere to in order to be brainwashed into so-called transgenderism or gender ideology. This is news to me, and that is because so-called transgenderism is not real. It's not a thing. It is completely made up with the sole intent of demonizing trans people. It's also a perpetuation of the groomer narrative that people are using to demonize trans people. Listen to this form of rhetoric again.
It is all or nothing. If transgenderism is true, if men really can become women, then it's true for everybody of all ages.
However, we must understand, trans kids exist. Queer kids exist. Michael Knowles, who is saying all of this, by the way, he is not saying this to acknowledge the existence of trans kids. He's trying to perpetuate the myth of social contagion, which is the belief that you become trans through some form of virus or some form of disease. Of course, scientifically, this has been debunked to hell by the American Academy of Pediatrics, but I digress. Because Michael Knowles wouldn't have stated that if he didn't follow it up with this.
If transgenderism is false, as it is, if men really can't become women, as they cannot, then it's false for everybody too.
He just squarely admitted that he already assumes the answer. Even though the American Academy of Pediatrics has already scientifically debunked his statement here on a scientific level, he is still perpetuating this in front of millions of Americans. So if Michael Knowles, who is advocating against transgenderism or gender ideology, cannot put a description or definition as to what gender ideology is or why being trans is part of gender ideology, then I think the burden of proof is on us, and we have to discuss what gender ideology is. We kind of just have to do the work for them, because as we discussed earlier, an ideology is a set of beliefs, principles, and values. Which means we're going to have to assume here that these set of beliefs, principles, and values in terms of gender ideology involves the beliefs, principles, and values surrounding gender. Well, I would say the closest thing I've ever heard to anything remotely close to so-called gender ideology would be the nuclear family model, and that's what we're going to be spending most of this podcast talking about. So what is the nuclear family? Is it a family that has been radiated with toxic waste? Well, maybe. But anthropologist, University of Pittsburgh and Yale University graduate George Murdoch had this to say about the nuclear family. And this is a quote. "The family is a social group characterized by common residence, economic cooperation, and reproduction. It contains adults of both sexes, at least two of whom maintain a socially approved relationship, and one or more children, own or adopted, of sexually cohabiting adults." End quote. Already the word sex has shown up twice in that definition alone, but I'm digressing. Because the nuclear family model is the everyday average Joe family as we understand it in contemporary, modern, mainstream, traditional, heteronormative society. A cisgender man who is the dad, a cisgender woman who is the mother, and one or two or three children, probably a pet being a dog or a cat or both, And you can easily look at this as how it is represented in popular media like The Simpsons, Married with Children. What I do find interesting is that the number of nuclear family models have gone down since the 1970s in comparison to the 2000s. According to the United States Census Bureau, the 1970s saw that 40.30% of American households were nuclear families, but in the 2000s, that number declined dramatically to 24.10%. Meanwhile, single parents have dramatically increased to surpass the number of nuclear families, rendering nuclear families in the minority in this case. So what happened here? How did we come to this situation today? Well, in 1969, California became the first state in all of the United States to pass a no-fault divorce law, meaning that both parties don't have to prove any wrongdoing in order for a divorce to happen in the first place. Just as a tangent, I find it kind of funny that Steven Crowder is so adamantly against no-fault divorce laws when it was actually Republican Governor Ronald Reagan who was the person to introduce and pass that law in the first place.
Let me say on the outset, to be clear, there is no infidelity, any kind of physical abuse at all on either side, and no, this was not my choice. My then wife decided that she didn't want to be married anymore. And in the state of Texas, that is completely permitted.
And I think that since Steven Crowder is living in Texas and he is currently going through a divorce himself, I think his intentions are pretty clear that he just wants to have his ex-wife around his finger despite how abusive their relationship was towards her.
It's been the most heartbreaking experience of my life, what I consider to be my deepest personal failure. And just so you know, my opinions on parenting and families have not changed.
Stephen, no, we are at an impasse, okay? I love you, but Stephen, your abuse is sick. Your abuse
Watch it.
is sick.
Watch it.
I've always believed that children need a mom and a dad, that divorce is horrible. And I still believe that children need a mom and a dad and that divorce is horrible. But in today's legal system, my beliefs don't matter.
All I'm saying is that his opposition towards no-fault divorce laws is very coincidental to right around the time he's dealing with a divorce himself. And in a way, it sort of makes it very convenient for Steven Crowder to scapegoat the law to be like a big boogeyman of his next big spiel. Oh shit, I'm going through a really tough patch right now in my life. I'm going through a divorce. I need something to draw attention, to draw sympathy towards me. Oh, no-fault divorce laws? It's those wokes again with the no-fault divorce law. How could they? I got divorced because the system allowed my wife to be able to divorce my abusive ass. I tell you what, there's no fault on both sides. There's no infidelity on both sides whatsoever. Definitely don't ask my wife what the fuck happened behind closed doors. Steven Crowder, my man, you're supposed to be funny. You're a comedian. This is not funny. This is a really washed up bit, and it's not funny. Come on, Steven, where's the setup? Where's the punchline? Is it you? Are you the punchline? A lot has happened, especially since the No-Fault Divorce Act have been introduced in the state of California and the country abroad, such as the Fair Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which allowed for women to register to get a credit card. I would say that the reason why we saw a decline in nuclear families is because women were given a lot more agency and resources to make their own living decisions autonomously, didn't have to rely on the Fred Flintstone character of the nuclear family to provide for them. No, if a woman wanted to take out a loan to purchase a car or purchase a house or purchase some university tuition, then by all means, they should be allowed to do so. That's important. The loaning industry is definitely a predatory one, but it is a right that women should have in the first place, especially if it can help them retain that agency of autonomy. But I want you to re-listen to one thing that Steven Crowder said when he was complaining about his divorce and his no-fault divorce predicament.
Just so you know, my opinions on parenting and families have not changed. I've always believed that children need a mom and a dad, that divorce is horrible. And I still believe that children need a mom and a dad and that divorce is horrible. But in today's legal system, my beliefs don't matter.
There is that word, belief. These are his beliefs. This is how he thinks families should and must be maintained in this particular fashion that is actively being proven to fail in front of his very fucking eyes. It is my understanding, in the context that he is referring to here, these beliefs that he is expressing under the assumption that they're about gender roles, this is a form of gender ideology. Gender ideology being a set of beliefs specifically around the roles of different genders. And that can go for expectations and values, what gender means to you. And so these are Steven Crowder's expectations of gender roles. But are these expectations of gender roles legitimate? According to the U.S. Census Bureau and National Center for Health Statistics, nearly half of all marriages end in divorce. And according to the CDC, nearly 7.8 million women have been raped by an intimate partner at some point in their lives, or that if it's domestic abuse for that matter, which, by the way, yes, 40% of cops are domestic abusers. Those are families of law enforcement. These are the behaviors that stem from the virulently not only transphobic but overall patriarchal expectations of gender roles, that is heteronormativity. Not to mention, domestic abuse overall is the leading cause for injuries towards women between 15 and 44 years old. According to a fact sheet conducted by Childhelp back in July of 2010, 68% of sexually abused children are from their own family members. And of course, that's not taking into account other types of community predators that usually fall under this umbrella, like law enforcement officers, teachers, priests, and of course, local politicians. So I find that since heteronormativity is the main strand that make up what the nuclear family is, I think it is fair to state that nuclear families are set up like a hierarchy, and if you're an anarchist like myself, you know that hierarchies deserve to be deconstructed to see if they hold legitimacy. Based on the data and examples that we have used throughout this podcast today, we can conclude that heteronormative families should not be something that is enforced by law. That means specifically expectations as to what gender roles should be and how gender traditions should be respected, or rather enforced if we're being honest with ourselves as to how the Republican Party wants to discuss the discourse of no-fault divorce laws. The same can be said for how abortion laws are currently being attacked by the right wing as well, because again, they want to maintain control over women's bodies. That's their whole agenda, is to destroy any avenue that women have to express for autonomy. This also ties into trans rights as well, since all of these, as you are starting to notice a pattern here, have something to do with medical health care. The Republican winning on issues like no-fault divorce and abortion and gender-affirming health care is to strip the rights of many, many millions of Americans across the country, especially considering that our economy is not set up to support parents in their early 20s, let alone teenage parents like 10-year-olds getting pregnant from incest and rape. It is absolutely ridiculous the extreme length that anti-abortionists will go through to demonize people who get abortion because they're not financially prepared to raise a child at the age that they're at. If anything, you'd be doing the child a favor by aborting the child from being born into a really shitty financial situation. By doing this, you give babies who do become born a better opportunity for not only their parents, but as children to succeed when they grow up. And I'm just a little repulsed that this is continuing to happen, as this is just reinforced gender ideology. Heteronormativity is gender ideology. And what makes up of the nuclear family model is gender ideology. It's an ideology. It's an idea of to what gender roles are and how they should serve in the public abroad. And that's what all of this boils down to. It's an ideology. It's belief systems that are ingrained into people culturally. These are ideologies around gender. And so when the Republican Party says that there's a conspiratorial trans agenda that is coming for your kids and destroying Western civilization, these are basically white supremacist dog whistles, especially if you are familiar with the 14 words, which for the sake of TOS I will not recite, but they have to do with children, in particular white children. And as I've stated in a previous video, children have everything to do with their ideology. Like, children are the main point of their ideology. I am, of course, talking about white supremacy. It is a gender ideology, believe it or not. But okay, what about trans people? Is so-called transgenderism an ideology? Well, the phrasing of the word transgenderism does seem to ring a similar vibe to what would be considered an ideology. But transgenderism isn't a thing. There's no doctrine, set of values as to what makes a trans person. It's a little ridiculous, in fact, because the secret here is when they're referring to transgenderism, they're really referring to trans people existing in the first place. And since there has been a rise of acknowledgement as to who trans people are, or, awareness, trans people have become the hot button topic for these kinds of political discourses. And every time it comes up, it tends to look really bad because it's all represented by a lot of people who are not trans. And unfortunately, the loudest trans representation are people like Blair White, who work with the very same people who perpetuate these kinds of rhetorics against trans people. It's like a fucking money pipeline that essentially gets people to believe that trans people ought to be wiped out. Like how PragerU wasted $1 million to promote on Twitter for the record, their new film against trans people. So I'm really here in this position just looking at all the variables, and I just have to conclude that the nuclear family, as in the American Joe, as it is reinforced by our homophobic and patriarchal system, it's a gender ideology. And it is being reinforced by the Christo-fascists and theocratic fascists in our political system. So the next time somebody says, oh, that's gender ideology, when you start talking about trans people, maybe ask them what the fuck is gender ideology in the first place, because they probably heard it from some Joe Schmo like Tim Pool or Matt Walsh.